August 15, 1945. Across the empire, millions of soldiers kneel in silence, listening to a voice none of them have ever heard. For generations, the emperor was a living god, distant and unreachable. But now, through a battered radio speaker, he speaks, not of victory but surrender. In jungles, on battleships, inside bunkers carved into volcanic rock, hardened men feel their world collapse in a single broadcast. Some refuse to believe it. Others weep openly. Because in that moment, Japan's warriors are forced to confront the unimaginable, the end of everything they were raised to die for. August 1945 arrives not as a month, but as a collapse. Across Japan's shattered empire, the war that once seemed destined for glory now unravels with a terrifying speed. Entire cities lie in ruins: Tokyo, Osaka, Kobe, burned into skeletal grids by relentless waves of American firebombing. Supply lines that once fed vast armies in China, Burma, and the Pacific are strangled. Isolated garrisons from Bougainville to Manchuria wait behind crumbling defenses, cut off from food, fuel, and even news. The empire is still enormous on a map, but hollow in reality. Starvation, disease, and ammunition shortages have become as common as the rising sun painted on their flags. Amid this devastation stands a paradox of power: Emperor Hirohito. To the Japanese people, and especially the soldiers, he is not merely a ruler. He is a divine presence, a living descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu. His image is sacred, his voice unheard. Not even senior generals, men who command armies of hundreds of thousands, have casually heard him speak. His words are carried only through formal written rescripts, filtered through layers of government and military bureaucracy. For the rank-and-file soldier, the emperor's voice is an idea, not a sound. And that idea is reinforced by the brutal messaging of the war's final months. Propaganda, flooding through radio broadcasts and field newspapers, promises that Japan will fight until its last breath. 100 million die together becomes the unspoken national doctrine. Officers demand that every unit fight to annihilation. Surrender is shame. Survival is suspect. Even on remote islands where no hope remains, commanders order suicidal charges rather than yield a single rifle. Then, in the thick of this darkness, a rumor spreads quietly at first, then with a force stronger than artillery. An emergency broadcast will soon be delivered across the empire, not from the prime minister, not from a general, but from the emperor himself. Soldiers pause. Engineers set down their tools. Civilians gather around radios with trembling hands. In every corner of the collapsing empire, men who have never heard their sovereign speak prepare to listen for the first time in their lives. No one knows why the silence of centuries is about to break. But every man believes the same thing: a divine command is coming. And in these final hours, they expect it to demand the ultimate sacrifice. Across the collapsing empire, the moment arrives with no ceremony, only urgency. Field commanders, many still wearing torn and smoke-stained uniforms, bark orders through hoarse voices. Silence. Gather around the radio. In ruined barracks, in jungle dugouts, in the shadows of burned-out factories, soldiers who have lived through years of brutality scramble to find a working receiver. Some pull dusty civilian radios from abandoned homes. Others huddle around sets wired together from spare parts and scavenged batteries. Anything capable of catching a signal suddenly becomes sacred. But the airwaves are chaos. Static surges like tidal waves. Signals flicker, vanish, return. The infrastructure that once carried the emperor's authority has been shattered by months of bombing. Power stations lie in ruins. Broadcast towers lean like snapped trees. The message, recorded on fragile phonograph discs, must be transported through a nation on fire, guarded by units that barely have enough fuel to keep vehicles running. Even in Tokyo, technicians in the NHK studio anxiously thread the disc onto a turntable, praying that the building isn't hit again before the transmission completes. Then slowly the noise clears. A ceremonial melody filters through the static. Soldiers straighten. Some kneel. Others press their helmets to their chests. No one knows what they are about to hear, only that it will come from a voice none of them have ever known in life. The emperor begins, soft, high-pitched, formal. His speech, delivered in archaic court Japanese, sounds distant and trembling through the damaged lines. Many soldiers cannot even understand the structure of the words, but their meaning cuts deeper than clarity. Hirohito speaks of the new and most cruel bomb, acknowledging the devastation inflicted by the atomic attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He speaks of a war situation, not necessarily to Japan's advantage. And then the unthinkable. He instructs his people to endure the unendurable and accept the terms of surrender. Silence follows, vast, suffocating silence. Across the Pacific and Asian fronts, men stare at one another in disbelief. Some shake their heads, insisting they must have misheard. Others argue that it must be coded language, a disguised command to launch a final, desperate attack. Veterans who survived Guadalcanal, Imperial, Saipan, and Okinawa feel their legs tremble in a way they never did under fire. Because in these few minutes, everything they were taught collapses. Years of indoctrination, sacrifice, and obedience unravel with a single broadcast. And within the stunned silence, one word begins to spread, whispered, denied, repeated with rising panic. Surrender. A word powerful enough to ignite chaos. The emperor's voice fades into static, but its impact reverberates like an artillery blast across the vast, scattered remnants of the Japanese Empire. On the front lines, from the rice fields of China to the steaming jungles of Borneo, from the battered ridges of Okinawa to the last dugouts of Luzon, soldiers stand frozen, caught between disbelief and a grief they cannot yet name. In northern China, units of the Kwantung Army that once boasted of invincibility stare at their radios in stunned silence. Some men simply set their Arasaka rifles on the ground and walk away, as though the war has been physically pulled out of their bodies. Others throw their weapons into rivers, the metallic splashes echoing through quiet valleys that only hours earlier seemed destined for renewed fighting against the advancing Soviets. Hardened veterans who had survived years of brutal campaigns sit motionless, hands trembling, faces hollow. For them, the shock is total. The spiritual center of their world has surrendered. In the Philippines and Borneo, where isolated garrisons have been cut off for months, disbelief turns to fury. Some soldiers scream that the broadcast is an American forgery, a psychological operation to break their will. Men hammer fists against trees, slap radios, swear that the emperor would never command surrender. Elite units, especially those indoctrinated to fight to the death, such as elements of the 32nd Army remnants on Okinawa, refuse to accept the message at all. To them, the idea that Hirohito himself would end the war is unimaginable. Surrender is not just defeat, it is the destruction of their identity. A single stunned phrase spreads through units everywhere. The emperor spoke and we lost. Then the emotional collapse begins. Soldiers weep openly, some tearing patches from their uniforms, others begging officers to explain what the words truly mean. Military police detachments struggle to maintain discipline as men surge with anger, confusion, and despair. Some officers attempt to calm their units. Others, unable to face what surrender means, conceal the truth and insist the war continues. Within hours, the iron discipline forged over generations under the code of Bushido begins to fracture. A worldview built on sacrifice and absolute obedience shatters. The myth of an eternal, invincible Japan dissolves in real time. And in dozens of remote outposts across the empire, armed groups refuse to obey the broadcast at all, setting the stage for mutinies that will ignite in the days to come. As the emperor's words ripple across the remnants of Japan's far-flung war machine, not every unit accepts them. In the shadows of collapsing front lines, mutiny brews, driven by fanatics who believe surrender is worse than death, and by soldiers who cannot reconcile devotion to their emperor with the order to lay down their arms. In China's interior, elements of the Kwantung Army refuse to acknowledge the broadcast at all. Some commanders declare the message a fabrication, insisting that Hirohito must have spoken under enemy pressure. Rumors spread like wildfire that American infiltrators hijacked the signal, or that the emperor was forced into silence, replaced by an actor. Anything, soldiers say, is more believable than the idea of Japan abandoning the war. Officers steeped in decades of militaristic doctrine cling to the only reality they know: victory through sacrifice. Several declare the imperial rescript invalid and issue their own counterorders, calling for one final honorable death attack. In the dense jungles of Borneo, one such garrison begins preparing for a suicidal counteroffensive. Ammunition is rationed. Mortars are dug into firing positions. Soldiers sharpen bayonets in silence, convinced they are moments away from a glorious final charge against Allied forces they have not seen in months. Across the Pacific, aboard scattered naval vessels that have survived the U.S. submarine stranglehold, similar defiance flares. Some crews refuse to strike the colors, unwilling to lower the rising sun that has flown over ships of the combined fleet since the First Sino-Japanese War. To them, surrender at sea is an unforgivable disgrace. They pace decks with clenched fists, debating whether to scuttle their ships or launch a doomed attack to preserve a shred of honor. Confusion fractures entire units. Younger soldiers whisper anxiously, desperate to go home, clinging to the broadcast's promise of survival. Others, indoctrinated since childhood, demand continued resistance. The emotional conflict is paralyzing. The emperor has spoken, but the spirit of militarism insists that their duty is to die, not surrender. In Manchuria, violence erupts as extremist officers attempt to drag reluctant soldiers into forbidden last-stand operations. In Tokyo itself, the remnants of the extremist Kyujo incident, conspirators still dream of coups and assassinations, believing the surrender order must be overturned with blood if necessary. Even after the broadcast, fragments of their ideology echo throughout frontline camps. Yet amid the chaos, a shift begins. Senior officers, those with access to Tokyo's final communications, confirm the truth. The emperor's command is authentic. The war is over. And once that confirmation spreads, everything changes. The mutinies begin to subside only when the truth becomes undeniable. Couriers arrive carrying the imperial rescript in written form, stamped, authenticated, impossible to dispute. Field commanders gather their units, unfolding the carefully printed words that echo the broadcast the soldiers struggled to believe. For the first time in Japan's modern military history, formal orders contain a phrase many never expected to see: cease hostilities, not redeploy, not counterattack, not defend to the last man, simply stop. The words hang in humid air over trenches in China and drift through scorched ruins on Okinawa. Men trained to fight without surrender repeat the order mechanically, as if saying it aloud might somehow change its meaning. Some whisper in disbelief, "Is this how a warrior's life ends?" Others stand motionless, their rifles slack in their hands, unable to reconcile years of sacrifice with a single command to end it all. For many, relief comes like a flood, a sudden release from terror and exhaustion. Soldiers who survived the firestorms of Manila, the Soviet offensive in Manchuria, or the nightmare of Luzon feel the tension drain from their bodies. They are alive, and the war that threatened to consume them finally stops. But relief is only one half of the emotion spreading across the ranks. The other is shame, sharp, overwhelming, and paralyzing. Shame at having lived while so many died. Shame at defeat. Shame at returning home to a nation that will never resemble the one they left. Across the empire's last frontiers, isolated pockets of troops hear the message only days later. In jungle outposts cut off from all communication, surrender arrives like an echo from a world they barely remember. These soldiers lower their weapons slowly, some after skirmishing with Allied patrols even after 15 August, unaware that the empire had already collapsed. Then comes the moral reckoning. Men who carried out brutal campaigns in China or Southeast Asia, men who lost entire platoons in hopeless defenses, men who lived through starvation, disease, and unimaginable violence, all confront the same hollow question. What was it all for? Years of indoctrination unravel in minutes, replaced by a void where purpose once lived. The emotional shock spreads beyond the battlefield. Families across Japan, Korea, China, and the Pacific hear the news with the same mixture of disbelief and devastation. Civilians cry in the streets. Mothers collapse in grief or relief. Entire villages fall silent. As the empire's guns grow quiet, a darker question rises, not about the war that ended, but about the men whose world vanished with one broadcast. What becomes of soldiers when the storm they were forged for finally disappears? The moment the emperor's voice reached his people on 15 August 1945, Japan crossed a threshold from which it could never return. For generations, soldiers had been taught that surrender was unthinkable, that death in service of the emperor was the highest virtue a man could achieve. In a single broadcast, that worldview collapsed. Millions who had been conditioned to fight to the last breath suddenly faced a new identity, not warriors in an unending struggle, but survivors of a war the emperor himself had chosen to end. In the years that followed, veterans spoke of their first thoughts when they finally understood the broadcast. Some admitted to overwhelming shame, believing they had failed their ancestors and their fallen comrades. Others described pure relief, a clarity that washed over them as they realized they might live long enough to see home again. Many felt anger, not at the emperor, but at the commanders and ideology that pushed Japan into a war it could not win. And a few expressed gratitude, recognizing that without the emperor's intervention, they would have died in battles already lost. The broadcast became a psychological breaking point, not only for soldiers but for the entire nation. For centuries, the emperor had been revered as a divine figure whose words carried spiritual authority. When Hirohito spoke in the calm, archaic language of the Imperial rescript, acknowledging the new and most cruel bomb, and urging his people to endure the unendurable, a pillar of Japanese identity shifted. The facade of divine invincibility disintegrated. Militarism, once the guiding force of the empire, fractured under the weight of reality. Historians argue that without the emperor's voice, the war could have dragged on for months. Japan still had more than 6 million troops across Asia and the Pacific. Many garrisons were prepared to fight to the last man. An invasion of the home islands, Operation Downfall, was expected to result in catastrophic casualties, millions of Japanese dead, and hundreds of thousands of Allied losses. The broadcast prevented that future. It saved lives on a scale no single order in modern warfare had ever achieved. What followed was a transformation unprecedented in global history. An empire devastated by total war rebuilt itself into a nation defined by peace, reconstruction, and democracy. Factories once dedicated to aircraft and munitions shifted to radios, automobiles, and electronics. Soldiers returned home to rebuild families and communities, carrying with them the memory of the moment their world ended and began again. The war did not conclude with a final charge or a climactic battle. It ended with a voice, distant, trembling, unmistakable, a voice no soldier ever expected to hear. And that voice reshaped the fate of millions.